presentation. Okay, I know that we'll have others joining us and we'll be admitting them into the session as we move forward. But I know we've got some great content today and I want to make sure we have time to get to all of that, including any questions that you might have. So first of all, good afternoon and welcome. This is the first part of our 4-part child assessment learning series. I'm Christina Ellis. I'm the Academy Manager, and I'll be NHSA's host for this series. So today's session that's for early Head Start and Thursday's Head Start session, we're going to dig into the purpose of child assessments and the different available types. Session 3 will cover how to select the tools that are best for your program. And then in the final session, we're going to wrap it all up together and we're going to create a plan that you can take back to your program and use. Before we get into that, I want to make sure that we mention our partners in the series. Today is the OU Early Childhood Education Institute, and later on, you're going to hear from EC Prism. I had the opportunity to sit in on the planning meetings for this series, and I can tell you guys, the thought and care that went into each step of the series is unbelievable. I learned a lot of new terminology. It was an opportunity for me to reflect on my own experience with assessments. And I also felt validated in the assessment knowledge I already had from the 20+ years in the field that I had. And so I really hope that as you are out there experiencing this today and through the rest of the series, that you feel the same way at the end, that maybe you can leverage what you already know and gain additional insight about assessments. So why are we doing this series? And here's the truth. We need better child assessments. We all know, and we can all probably repeat this sentence from the Head Start performance standards, is that it requires us to use child assessments for individualization and assure the assessment meets certain requirements. But what we aren't given is they don't require or recommend any specific tools. So what child assessments should you use? Why should you use them? And do your current tools even meet your program needs? So hopefully you've had a chance to look at that self-reflection worksheet that we provided to maybe answer some of those questions. But in our last conversation in the planning meeting, we really spoke a lot about sort of outside of that Head Start performance requirement. A lot of the times when we talk about assessments, there's sort of a negative, filled around it. And we really want to start it off with sort of the positive and benefits that assessments can provide educators, parents, and families with that critical information about a child's development and growth. So some of these include, they're not all inclusive, is we all know that they're going to provide a record of growth in all development areas. Sometimes they're used to identify children who may need additional support. Your classroom instructors are using it for individualized instruction. It's used to identify strengths and weaknesses within a program. And what I personally like is I think it provides that common ground between your educators and your families that they can collaborate on strategies together to support the children. And so that's sort of the why we are here and the what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. But now let's get started with our first presentation. I'd like to introduce Sherry Castle to you. I've known her for several years as a colleague back in Oklahoma. Dr. Castle is the Assistant Director of Research and current Acting Director of the ECEI. This is an applied research organization at the University of Oklahoma's Tulsa campus. There, she leads a dynamic team of researchers who partner with local Head Start and early childhood programs to co-create research studies to inform agencies' goals and better understand how to support children's development. She and her team conduct hundreds of child assessments and classroom observations each year and provide specialized guidance on aligning data collection with questions of interest and interpreting data to generate actionable findings. So welcome, Sherry. We're excited to hear what you have to say today, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Christina. I'm really excited to be here. So I wanted to first take a moment to say thank you so much to all of you for joining today. Thanks to the other members on the planning committee and the folks who will present in subsequent sessions. I know that for all of you joining today, that as Head Start leaders, you're extraordinarily busy people with many important priorities and pulled in multiple directions. And that's even before the pandemic hit all of us. I know that many of you today throughout the session may be receiving messages alerting you to additional children, teachers, classrooms that need to quarantine, and wanted to note that if you get pulled away, the session will be recorded for you to return to later. But we're so pleased that you're here today and can just really focus and dig into the topic of assessment. So we're going to jump right in and hope that each of you learned something new today and walk away with some concrete next steps for your program's assessment plan. So our purpose today, along with what Christina was saying, is really today to provide some foundational information about the purpose and the use of assessments in the context of early Head Start. So whenever you sit down to design your assessment package for your early Head Start program, as Christina was saying, you have a lot of blue sky space to kind of craft what your program's assessment plan is going to look like because you're given requirements, but then a lot of flexibility to really build it out in alignment with your program's needs and purposes. So today, I just want to give you a quick kind of roadmap of our agenda. We're going to start out by just focusing a little bit on the early Head Start context in particular, what might be, how it's uniquely situated in this discussion about assessment. We'll talk about the purpose of assessment, when meaning your particular purpose for assessment or purposes for assessments. We'll focus on the different types of assessments, talk about some different strategies or modalities of assessment. And then all of this comes together to really help you have the tools that you need to evaluate assessments that you're considering to see if they align with your intended purpose and other criteria that you might design based on what we talk about today. So before we jump into the content of the conversation today, I just wanted to take a brief moment to have a little caution and a request from you. So as we set out to assess our child assessment strategy, to really kind of interrogate why is it that we are doing these assessments, and to really make sure that we are confident that this is our best package that we can put together for our program, let's admit that this is no easy challenge. Measuring any aspect of human development is very complex. It's very nuanced. It's just a very complicated challenge. There is no blood test to come and give me a precise count or level of children's social emotional skills, for example. Whereas if we want to talk about cholesterol, I can go get a quick little lab work done and I have my answer. But measuring child development is definitely more complicated than that and more nuanced. So this is a complicated question or set of questions. You also have the real world constraints of your limited resources and bandwidth. But all of that, pulled together, we are all here to do the best for the children in the programs, in your programs, in the early Head Start and Head Start programs around the country. So as we dig into this complicated question with our real world constraints, we can find ourselves reaching a point of so many options, these complicated decisions, we can kind of get exasperated and just say, forget it. Let's just stick with what we've always done. It's sort of been working. We haven't gotten in trouble for it. Let's just keep doing that. Even though we've kind of found out and learned a little bit of information that let us know that we might not be using the data the way that it's intended. This might be known, very technical term, as the head in the sand approach. On the other hand, when we get serious about digging into and intentionally designing and refining our assessment plan, it can become clear that no tool or assessment is perfect. Each one has some weaknesses, some flaws, some pros and cons. When it comes to that sort of situation, it can also be easy to say, oh, forget it. I was really going to try to dig in and expand our assessments of infant toddlers to be more comprehensive and more aligned with ELOF. but this tool is flawed, that tool is flawed, so let's just scrap the whole thing, disband this committee, otherwise known as the proverbial throw the baby out with the bathwater. Forget this business. So my guess is that you probably identify more strongly with one or the other of these approaches. And wherever you land on this continuum, whenever decision making gets tough, I encourage us all to just take a moment and commit and recommit as we go through this process to staying in the messy middle and working through these discussions to reach the strongest assessment plan for your program for now. It won't be perfect, it won't be forever, but given what you know, given your program's circumstances, all of the reality that you deal with, really settling in and designing the best program for now. So I don't know about you all, but just looking at this little image representing the messy middle kind of makes me a little uncomfortable. But much can be learned when we embrace the messy middle. If we settle into that discomfort, commit to working through it. We can also acknowledge that many people have complicated histories with assessment, might have felt sort of beaten up or shamed by data in the past, and we can really work through those complicated situations and various feelings that folks might have. And there's some real benefits to this. So we can model for our teams and talk through overtly that there's this potential for growth. We can dig in and identify places where we can highlight progress, not perfection, and that is, just a little bit of improvement is worth celebrating. So we're going to embrace the continuous improvement and let go of that aim for perfection, because we acknowledge this will be a process and there is no such thing as perfection. So since we've kind of acknowledged some of the bad history some folks might have with assessment and the complications of this situation, I'd like to invite you to drop into the chat your best and or worst experiences regarding assessment. What are, just a couple of lines kind of describing what some experiences might be that represent this piece of the messy middle for you. Yeah, so I'm starting to see a few responses here. And some of this reflects also what we got as you were registering for the webinar series, is that, sometimes the tools themselves are complicated, the technology freezes up, it doesn't generate the reports like you would want them to. You don't, there's the logistical pieces of like getting people's time freed up to be able to do the assessments. Helping staff to understand the complexities of assessment and the why behind assessment, staff turnover, keeping up with, just as soon as you get somebody, fully on board and understanding, then they head off to another opportunity. Making sure that we're getting good data in the first place so that we have good information to be forming our conclusions from, and then knowing what to do with them. It's definitely complicated, and I do think we're going to kind of come full circle to this at the very end, that helping folks understand the why behind assessment, it won't completely undo some of these challenges of staff, doing things to fidelity, but I think it can go a long ways to helping them embrace the need for training, embrace the need for the protocol, if they really understand some of the potential consequences if they don't. And I don't mean consequences from a like staffing kind of perspective, but just that the data will not be meaningful, and we want those data to be meaningful. All right, feel free to keep dropping those in the chat, and we'll definitely be saving these and making sure that we're orienting any future trainings based on that feedback. I'm going to move on along, and you're welcome to keep using the chat. So whenever we think about the early Head Start context, of course, there's the early learning outcomes framework, which I suspect that all of you have seen a time or two. So, the goals here that are within the domains and subdomains, provide these broad expectations of children's learning and development. And then the goals within there, we can see the developmental progressions that helps us, identify specific skills to be looking for. And many of these things are, what we're wanting to assess on, right? As we want to see how is children's development proceeding. So whenever we think about the early Head Start context in particular, it creates like a really interesting little niche context to think about, because early Head Start is kind of more removed from the pressures of school readiness. It allows us to sometimes more naturally focus on each child's developmental pathway. During this time of infancy and toddlerhood, we're also seeing development happen so rapidly, right before our eyes in real time. And sometimes in more obvious ways that remind us that children's development proceeds at their own pace, and we're there as supportive standers-by. So, for example, like there's not pressure to tutor children on crawling, right? Because no amount of tutoring in their crawling skills is going to speed up their timeline and attaining that milestone or their excellence. There isn't some like rating and excellence of crawling that we might feel that sort of pressure whenever we're thinking about preparing children's reading skills. So this context removes some of the sense of accountability for the data produced by child assessments. But at the same time, developmental science is clear that how we support the development in these early years is critical. With this context of early Head Start, we'll approach the questions about assessment, and today's examples will draw on the developmental stages typically encountered in early Head Start, as well as understanding that there are some children who are within a classroom context and others who are receiving learning at home style services. So today we're going to focus on 4 guiding questions. You can see them here. So first we'll be talking about the why. What is the purpose for conducting our assessments? Second, we will be focusing on if the tool that you're considering, like as you work your way through systematically assessing tools and how they might fit, whether it's something you currently use or something you're considering adding to your battery, does it match the purpose that you're trying to accomplish? Third, we'll then focus on what are some qualifications of the tool that it might need to meet to be able to meet your goals. And then finally, does your use of the tool impact its ability to meet your program's goals? So just
Hey, Sherry, you lost your sound.
okay, did that fix it?
Yep.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so then we'll focus on the impact or the process, how you use the tool. It doesn't impact, make sure we don't have any unintended consequences. Okay, so why are we conducting assessments? So, and this is not a pop quiz, right? There is no, I'm not coming into this saying like, I'm going to see how many of these folks say the right answer, right? There is no right or wrong answer here. This is really about your program and you as leaders in your program identifying your own purposes, right? Because there are likely multiple purposes. So if you completed the self-assessment before the session today, you should have spent some time thinking about why your program conducts assessments. I'd like you to drop those thoughts from your self-assessment on that question into the chat to share with us all. I'm really interested to see your thoughts on this and see, what sort of ideas came to your minds as you worked through this individually or with your teams. If you didn't do the self-reflection, that's okay too. Your responses, just kind of off the cuff are certainly welcome. So why does your program conduct child assessments? And what value do you see these assessments bringing to your program? Okay, so I'm just kind of scrolling through some of the responses here and keep watching as they come in. Okay, so I see a lot of folks indicating that, we collect assessments to see, how the children's development is proceeding, where the child is, how we can further development, how we can, build on where they are now and anticipate next stages of development, how we might make changes to our teaching or, reteaching of things and scaffolding children's understanding. Programs do them for funding, certainly, as part of the requirements, and to guide instruction and individualization. So, everything about from individual children on to, understanding our classroom practices and how we might interact with the group of children in our care. See where the children are and guide individualization. Yes, keeps the staff focused, on the goals, make sure that we're, kind of staying aligned, and a record of growth. So yeah, you can see, and here we see stakeholders and data for grants and funding, school readiness, ability to make referrals, so kind of a screening component there. Yeah, so you can see as you yourself might scroll through those, you can see a variety of purposes reflected. And so as we, think about these fundamental questions, there's an even more fundamental question that we might take a quick step back and think about regarding what is assessment. So, and sometimes these things, we just throw these terms around and we forget to pause and just think about what do we really mean by that, or how can we reframe this to help empower our teachers to understand what is this word. It may feel very adversarial if they've worked in a in a context where data has been used in perhaps an unhealthy way, or maybe it's just kind of unnatural to them. So whenever we think about assessment, it's really just the process of gathering data, where data is information, process of gathering data. So more generally, and kind of like at the most lay kind of terms, we can view this as getting to know children, right? Getting to know children in some systematic way. So as we just saw in the responses that you provided, there are multiple purposes. And our goal for this series is to really help equip you to make the decisions to design an assessment plan that meets those purposes that you just put out there. So today we're going to be focusing on providing some key information to guide that planning work with these multiple types of assessments. We have multiple purposes. That means that we need multiple types, and each of these, they should be calibrated with your overall agency goals and intents, but then individual assessments that are going to have these different purposes, be better matched to different purposes. They should all be calibrated together for the broader purpose and goals that you intend. So the types of assessment, there are generally 3 types of assessment that we can discuss. Screening tools are quick, brief measures to identify indicators of risk, determine whether further evaluation is needed. Second, formative assessments provide ongoing monitoring of child's progress towards learning and developmental goals. And then finally, standardized assessments compare the children's progress to an identified benchmark. So we're going to dive into these more on the following slide. So here we're going to go through each of those 3 types of assessments and talk about 4 characteristics related to each type to really help it be clear to you the distinctions between the types of assessments, and then it becomes very apparent what the intended uses of these different assessments are, and what might be some of the challenges if we try to extrapolate too far from the intended purpose of an assessment to accomplish other goals that those assessments are just not really designed to be able to support. So we want to make sure that our choice of type of assessment is aligned with, our use, our intended purpose for it. So the timing and how often really answers the question of when and what intervals. The type of information and the feedback, as well as the rationale, really discuss the nature of the data being gathered and how it's most appropriately used. And then finally, the focus, in research terms, we call this the unit of measurement. And this just identifies who we are talking about when we use this type of tool. Now, I want to just give a quick caveat that, this is in a table format. We're going to talk about them as clearly and kind of separately as we can. People use different terminologies. There are some places where things are a little bit more gray, but this provides you with the general rubric to understand things. And I'm happy to answer any questions, that may come up from this style of sharing this. So whenever we think about screeners, this happens at the beginning as a child enters your program or enters your classroom, enters a new grade level, program level. And then the type of information gathered, we're really taking a targeted measurement here of a developmental level to assess strengths and weaknesses. And our rationale is really to understand where children are developmentally and when we first meet them. And these are not deep measures. They're kind of like surface checks to see, to be able to flag a child who may need some additional supports or may need evaluation to consider the need for additional supports. So throughout this, I'm going to use kind of a really real life layperson kind of example. And then later I'll get to a more schoolish kind of example and also an early Head Start specific example, because I find that different kinds of examples land with different people. Sometimes one makes more sense to you. It might stick with you where you can carry that with you as you move forward. So I'm just going to provide a variety of types of examples, and if they don't all work for you, that's fine. But I just wanted to provide a variety so that everyone can hopefully take away something that makes sense to you. So whenever we're thinking about a screener, so if you think you could have car trouble, right? So you take your car to the mechanic, and a screener looks like that little machine that they hook it up to, and you can even go to AutoZone or O'Reilly's or whatever you have in your region of the country, and it just reads out a code, right? It says some error code that they have it tells them what that means. So that's not real helpful on its own, but it gives us a hint of what direction to look into further for the important info, right? And it lets us know, oh, this car all seems to be working well, or heads up, this aspect of the car seems to not maybe be working so well. So that's kind of what we're looking at with the screener, is just a quick and easy way to get an early read of how children are doing when they show up in your program. Formative assessments, again, a different type with different purposes and some different characteristics. So here we're looking at assessments that are done throughout a child's time in your program on a regular basis. So this may be open-ended, like observations that are occurring in the natural context of the classroom. It can also be still occurring in the natural context of the classroom, but where a teacher is kind of observing a more focused set of skills, right? They could be looking for, does this child use 2-word phrases? Does this child stack blocks at least, 3 high? That sort of thing. And that can still be formative. We're looking here with the formative assessment to really capture the learning and progress. And in the process as children are, moving along those developmental trajectories. And these are used to help guide our interactions with the child, whether we're thinking about an individual child and how we might scaffold them to that next, to their zone of proximal development, to their next developmental step. And also thinking about our primary care groups or our classroom as a whole. In a learning at home kind of setting, this might be coaching the parent on noticing where their child's going to go next and helping the parent to anticipate and scaffold the child's learning in that regard. So here, if we're going back to our kind of car mechanic example, so this might look like if I've taken my car to the mechanic and I needed them to look at something in a little bit more depth and see what's really going on in the context of like driving around, right? So they might hop in the car with me. They might have a checklist that says, things to look for, and they're rating that. So there can definitely be some systematic nature to this, but it's still informed by that individual professional's lens of what is typical functioning, right? And how outside the bounds of typical is this, or what might I respond to that? There's definitely a subjective nature to this kind of assessment, and it's done in this context. There's not a right or wrong answer. It's really descriptive in nature. And then finally, we have standardized. And standardized assessments are conducted at the end of a specific period of time. So often this will be at the end of an academic year or at the end of a child's time in early Head Start, as they're ready to exit Head Start and move on to, or early Head Start and move on to Head Start. And the type of information that we're gathering here is really much more systematic than what we were just describing for formative. So this, often you're using a published assessment. It's going to have correct answers that are identified, where it's really pulling out the subjective aspect of that assessment. You're working to evaluate the learning of this child's skill level against some benchmark or comparison group. And whenever we're considering these, we're generally wanting to look at the school or program level, much more so than at a particular child, right? So we're really kind of zooming out is how I often think about it. We're zooming out and looking at our program as a whole. So we might, do this pre-COVID and post-COVID, for example. We might do this, to consider that I've implemented some new curriculum and I'm wanting to see how do the children who've experienced this new curriculum, how are they performing on these assessments compared to children in my program before we implemented this curriculum. So these are the sorts of pieces that we would consider and standardize. So here, this is much more of a hard data readout kind of thing. So, and this, you'll have to forgive me, this is sort of where my bandwidth on the whole car analogy runs out, but I'm assuming that there's some actual metrics where I could hook up, machinery to the engine and figure out what are the, engine's RPMs, what is the efficiency of that engine, and get some actual kind of objective data to help evaluate what's going on. And then if we switch over to a more schoolish kind of example, think about your high school language arts skills. So a screener, you might do a quick check of reading fluency and basic comprehensive, basic reading comprehension, which would let you sort of identify students who are outside of a range of scores that you just say, oh, that student definitely needs some additional checking up with, just to see, I'm a little bit worried about them. They might need some additional supports. The formative, we're looking at things where we might have a rubric to grade a, like a book report, for example, some sort of assignment. And the teacher assigns a grade, and that provides some information about the student's skills, but it also has quite a bit of subjectivity in the scoring and is influenced by the teacher's perceptions on what an appropriate level of skill is at this grade level. Even if we have a district-wide rubric and checklist, scores are going to be shaped by my understanding of what a skill should look like and how the student compares to other students in my classroom or prior classes. So this makes our scores in this formative zone not comparable across teacher, across school, across time. So we want to make really sure that we're very clear on the utility of the formative assessment data and the limits on that, right? It provides us very rich data, but it doesn't allow us to do these comparisons. And then finally, with standardized, if we're considering reading reading skills, we can think of something more like the SAT, where the items have a clear right or wrong answer. All students are scored on the same items with the same grading key, and reasonably trust that my daughter, who's a senior here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, her score on the SAT, if we find a kid who is in San Francisco or rural Montana who has a similar score, that reflects pretty similar skills. So these standardized assessments, the real benefit of them is to be able to compare to these benchmarks and also to compare against comparison groups. So hopefully you can see, whenever we're looking at an early Head Start context, so in screeners, many of you may use the Ages and Stages questionnaire. It lets us flag children who are outside the bounds of typical development so we can refer them for further evaluation, potentially early intervention. Formative assessments involve teachers assessing children or observing children's skills during regular classroom activities. So this should not be like, it's assessment time, sit down at the assessment table type of thing. Teachers can take notes, as children are working. They can keep samples of children's work or complete checklist. This happens throughout a child's time in the program and tracks a child's progress. And then whenever we're looking at the standardized assessments, this is a place where we're going to dive into on the next slide some other approaches to be able to do these standardized assessments. So that was a lot. So it will all be there for us to reflect back on later if if any of that needs clarification. But we need to think about also the assessment strategies. So some of this I highlighted as we went through the types of assessments, because certain types of assessments are definitely more well suited for different assessment strategies, but it's not, there's definitely some overlap. Those categories are not, necessarily that formative assessments can only be observation based or observation assessments can only be formative. So if we think separately about the assessment strategies, so we can go with the observation approach where the teachers are, as you see here in the sort of bottom left and bottom center photos, the teacher is interacting with the child during regular classroom activities, and they can just attend to what is the child, what kind of skills is the child demonstrating to me as we interact, and how can I support their ongoing development. We can also do direct assessment, and this tends to be more of the standardized type of assessments, where you're getting these right or wrong answer type of assessments of children's development. So this is the kind of work that you can do on your own in your program, and technology is improving and expanding our options of a direct assessment by allowing us to have some tablet-based or computer-based assessments that really let you have a more cost-effective way to be able to collect the more objective data. You can also partner with researchers. This is some folks from my team here in the bottom right and the top left, where we bring our research staff in and collect, with our professional staff, go ahead and have them collect those data. So there's a range of opportunities of how you can collect these, and it's important to know that you can pull information in using a variety of modalities. Another way that we might consider, another aspect of assessments, is the topic of assessments. So it might be aligned with ELOF, it could be holistic, or it could be domain specific. Like I might want to really drill down into the infant toddler domain of language and communication, thinking about vocabulary as a subdomain. That might really be something that we're working on in our curriculum. And so in our classrooms, I want to really delve into that assessment. It can also be, more holistic. We just want to see how children, our program, their development is proceeding. And it might also be driven by agency goals, or like we mentioned earlier, that you might have made a change to your curriculum and you want to see, do I find any impacts of that? All right, so moving on to question 2. So, and I promise all the other questions are much briefer. Question 1 is sort of the big, broad foundation. So question 2, does the tool I'm considering match the purposes I'm trying to accomplish? So if we think back to one of the purposes that you've identified for assessments in your program, and I sort of think about this as like a very systematic approach, right? So you like pick up one purpose that I'm going to try to figure out what's my plan to accomplish this purpose. Then I'm going to select an appropriate type of assessment, so based on this, then I'm going to select, if I want to know how to individualize for children in my classroom, I'm going to pick a formative assessment. If I want to be able to figure out, has this curriculum that my program has implemented made a change pre and post, well, then I need to pick up a standardized assessment. So I'm going to consider the assessment strategy that works given our, kind of logistical situations, whether we have staff to be able to support this or funds to be able to support an external partner coming in. I'm going to get clear on the topic of assessment. So really taking the time to be intentional and thinking carefully about, not just social emotional skills or something broad, but diving in carefully to say, what is it that we're very focused on here? And then we're going to systematically put all these pieces together. And that's really what, this series as a whole is about. And Christina and Victoria will be kind of closing us out in the final session to help you work through those conversations with your team as you put all those pieces together. But overall, we really want to think about, does our assessment match all these markers of an assessment plan that makes it well aligned to our purpose and needs? And we also have to think about some qualifications. Does this tool have to meet our goals? So it's like, all right, I think I've found something that seems pretty promising, but before I hire this assessment, before I formally adopt it, I want to make sure that it checks some important, qualifications. One is the technical merit. So when we think about the technical merit, the strengths of this assessment, you might have heard the terms reliability and validity. So this means that it is reliable if I can use the assessment, and then Christina can use the assessment, and then Victoria can use the assessment, and we all get pretty similar scores for the same child, then that tool is reliable. Valid means that we're actually measuring what we're trying to measure. So these are just kind of scooped up in technical merit, and that's the terminology that you'll hear about next time from EC Prism in utilizing their online tool to be able to identify good particular measures that will work for you. So we go on to consider the fit of assessment that you're considering. Another thing to consider is the cultural relevance. So is this tool proven for your context? Again, all of this is very customized. This is a big part of why Head Start hasn't, recommended a particular tool, because it's unique, to your purposes, it's unique to your context. So, the population of early Head Start, meaning the ages, also the demographic representation of your program. There are things that are just very different across cultural norms. There are orders of, like, the order in which words and types of words are learned differ across languages. All of those things are important to consider. We also want to make sure to consider the usability. This is whenever you have on your administrator hat, these things like time to administer, the skill of administration, how much skill does my folks who are going to be doing this tool, how much skill do they need? What formal training do they need? Does it give you immediately actionable data? And then finally, the cost, which is of course an important consideration in anything related to your programs. So these 4 qualifications here are will be addressed in more detail in the next webinar by EC Prism, where they're going to help walk you through their online tool that lets you assess these qualifications for a given particular measure, and to be able to search based on your identified criteria. And then finally, once we've done all of this really careful thinking and intentional planning to identify our purpose, select assessments that are aligned with those purposes, and fit our program's expectations and needs, our work is not quite done. So we've all heard that execution is everything, and we definitely don't want to quit before we've crossed the finish line and have all of that effort, not pay off. So the same is true of assessment. So we want to make sure that our planning time and our implementation time, all the expenses, the energy, the political will that we need to garner from our teams are all well spent and not inadvertently undermined. So I just wanted to kind of briefly talk about a few things that can happen. And the pictures here are kind of a hint. So maybe some of them, might bring things to your mind. So we can have some unintended consequences sometimes with our assessment plans if we aren't, that just happen. These are sometimes lessons learned that we have to then go back and fix. But if we can try to think through, okay, well, how will this work in my program? How will the staff react? How will this really look like an implementation? We can try to prevent some of these unintended consequences. So, one thing you can see there at the top photo, the technology mediated assessments, I think, are a beautiful thing, and they really do help you to be able to get good, pretty high quality data without having to pay an assessor to come in and do it, or pull your staff's time away from teaching to, go conduct these assessments. But we probably don't want, a child this age assessing on a computer, because they're more likely to just kind of be smashing buttons, all willy-nilly, and not really going to determine any, meaningful outputs here. We also want to think about our process surrounding it, and we don't want to be assessing a child whenever they're very sleepy. And that might be knowing that what the child's life, what's going on in their life. If they have, some disruption going on, well, then it might not be the right week to assess them. Or, if it's nap time, that's probably also not the right time to be, thinking we're going to get the best read on how children are doing. And so that really affects our process surrounding assessments. And I think that another important part is really being thoughtful, intentional about how you message around your assessments. So if we aren't careful, because our society is just so, data driven, is kind of baked in at this point. And I would argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing, but often in the educational landscape, it has become, it's become very heavy accountability rather than information. And so we certainly don't want the children to feel that there are winners and losers, as this final picture here on the right might reflect. We don't want our teachers to feel like there are winners and losers. We don't want to kind of pit, all right, this pot of teachers, let's see if you can get more child gains than that pot of teachers. Because that can certainly undermine morale. It can also show up in really interesting ways. Teachers might feel, if they're incentivized to show high growth, they might artificially, lower scores in the fall, or they might be convinced to teach to the test, or, they might practice some of these skills with children, and all of those things are not immoral or inherently bad or anything of that nature, but it does fundamentally undermine our goal to get accurate information about the children in our programs. And so the more that we can message that and try to get everyone on our team to understand that that's really the goal, we really want the most authentic, accurate understanding and representation of how the children are doing, then that's where we're all going to benefit the most from our assessment portfolios. So that was a lot, and that brings us to the end of this session. I hope that you've learned something new and gotten refreshed on some information you may have learned before. As we kind of start to wrap up, I'd like to make sure you leave this session today with some intention. So I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things, and we're just going to kind of hang out here for a few minutes. So I'd like you to share a takeaway, like your biggest takeaway or a next step that you're going to take, and drop that in the chat. I'd also encourage you to make a note for yourself about that takeaway or your next steps. You know, like we acknowledged at the beginning, things are kind of hairy right now around the country with, you know, COVID kind of resurging again. So maybe you can't do this right now. Maybe you don't have the bandwidth, but you can make a note for your future you by putting an appointment in your calendar with yourself, you know, a month from now to review this information. Speaking of calendars, make sure to save the date and join us for the remaining sessions that are indicated here on the slide again. And then as you're dropping your takeaways in the chat and also making notes to yourself, you're also more than welcome to drop your questions into the chat. And I'm happy to kind of answer a couple of questions or address a couple of comments as we have a few more minutes in our time together. So Christina, I don't know if you want to help work through the chat and field questions.
Yeah, while you're taking a look at the chat, I just wanted to have everyone join me in thanking Sherry for her engaging presentation. I'm really examining the sort of purpose and use of assessments in the context of early Head Start. I really love the examples and thought that something that is as complicated as assessments was really handled with care for all of us in the audience today. And then for the audience, as you're in there chatting, I just want to make sure that, and thank you for joining us today. Hopefully you learned something new and that you do come back to the next session where EC Prism will cover how to select the best tools for your program. I also have a reminder that Thursday's session is going to mimic today's session, but with Head Start examples. So while it's not required to attend both this week, as they will be very similar, it is recommended that if you do support both early Head Start and Head Start in your program, that you do come back on Thursday for a repeat of this session, again, with that Head Start lens. And I just want to thank all of you for your engagement as well. And Sherry, looking at the comments, are there are questions? Is there anything that you want to follow up on before we go ahead and let everyone go for the day?
So I see someone asking for the link for the next sessions. I don't know if Lucy has maybe already dropped that in there.
If we didn't drop the link to the next session, we could probably make sure to get that out as well. My understanding is whenever you registered for all. And so I do believe the link is the same. Lucy, can you confirm that?
Yep, it should be the same link. I'll see if I can find it just in case.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, and I don't see any specific questions here, but one thing that some of the comments reminded me of that we also saw in the registration info is, you know, as we pull apart, what are the challenging areas of this? Where is, you know, what barriers are we running into that's really kind of holding us up from feeling like we're getting maximal impact of our assessments? One thing I kept seeing was, I can pick an assessment, I can conduct the assessment, you know, that's kind of hard sometimes, but I can figure out how to do that. You know, that's within my wheelhouse. But I get kind of outside of my zone of expertise whenever I get these data, like what to do with those. So I want to say that you can certainly, even if you don't have capacity to be able to fully engage an external partner, there's certainly space where you can engage an external partner just for consultation on your data, right? To help you. One of the things that we do is sit down and, you know, focus on what are the actionable takeaways here, you know, and really try to say, is this, you know, is this gain something to get excited about, or is that, you know, or is this something to worry about, or is this just within the range of, you know, kind of like measurement error? So there are certainly folks like me around the country who you can engage in your local community, you know, at universities, and you know, I think Christina and Victoria would be happy to help connect folks as needed.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention, we said Victoria a couple of times. Victoria, and I, of course, her title is escaping me, but with data and, oh geez, it's gone out of my mind. But Victoria also works at NHSA and has been a big part of putting this all together, but she was out today. And so I'm sure that you will see her later on in the other series. Yes, thank you, Chief Data Officer. Thank you. You would think working with her, I'd have that right there, but I just know her as Victoria. But you'll be seeing her in some of our other sessions as well.
Yes, and then I do see the question came in about assessments in the home setting whenever you're, have a children in the home-based program. And I do think that it's definitely trickier whenever, you're not there to be able to shadow or pop in to see how is this going. You can try to mimic that some, we, like with our assessment staff, we certainly kind of take turns pretending to be the child in the assessment. And so I think you could do that in your own teams, have them kind of trade off. Okay, now what would you do if the child, did this particular thing, to try to get to some fidelity and reliability between your different raters. And again, I think the more that, it seems kind of like obtuse and weird to say you must follow the script exactly as written, and it feels very foreign and inauthentic. But the more that we can help people understand the reason why it matters and what happens if, if you give hints or if you, go off script because you really want to see this child succeed, then we just aren't getting the best information about where the child really is. So that, bringing it all back to it's just so we can get this, like, it's neutral. It's not, it's neutral information about how the child is doing. So I think, those tools together maybe would help with the home-based as well as the classroom-based.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sherry, for that. And thank you everyone for joining today. We will see you back here on Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your day.